A light before dawn. The story begins not in darkness, but in a strange, quiet light that rests gently over a land filled with tension, fear, and silent prayers. It is a land where rivers flow endlessly, where the great Nile breathes life into fields and cities, and where mighty palaces rise high with pride and power. Yet beneath this shining surface, something is deeply wrong. The air carries whispers of oppression, the cries of the weak echo through the streets, and the hearts of the believers tremble with both fear and hope. This is the land of Egypt, ruled by a king who does not just claim authority over people, but dares to claim divinity itself. And it is in this very land, in this very time, that a child will be born, a child whose name will be remembered across centuries, whose story will shake empires, and whose mission will change the course of history forever. This is the beginning of the story of Musa, a story not just of a man, but of a divine journey, a struggle between truth and falsehood, between tyranny and faith, between fear and unshakable trust in Allah. In those days, Egypt was under the rule of a tyrant known as Pharaoh, a man whose arrogance knew no limits. He was not just a king, he was a symbol of ultimate oppression. He divided his people into classes, raising some and humiliating others. Among those he oppressed were the children of Israel, known as Bani Israel, descendants of the noble prophet Yaqub, a.s. These people had once been honored, but now they lived as slaves, stripped of dignity, forced into hard labor, and treated as less than human. Pharaoh feared them, not because they were powerful, but because he sensed something he could not control. There was a prophecy, a whisper that spread through his court, that from among the children of Israel, a boy would be born who would grow up to challenge his rule, to break his power, and to end his tyranny. This prophecy planted fear deep in Pharaoh's heart, and fear quickly turned into cruelty. He ordered something unimaginable, something that would forever stain his legacy with blood. He commanded that every newborn boy from the children of Israel be killed. The land that once echoed with the laughter of children now echoed with cries of mothers. Soldiers roamed the streets, entering homes without mercy, snatching away innocent infants. Mothers hid their pregnancies, families lived in constant terror, and every birth became a moment of both joy and unbearable fear. It was a time when hope seemed impossible, when darkness felt endless, and when people wondered if relief would ever come. But Allah's plan was already in motion. In the midst of this terror, a woman carried a secret within her, a child growing in her womb. She was not a queen, not a woman of power or wealth, but her story would become one of the most powerful examples of faith in human history. She was the mother of Musa, a.s., a woman whose name is not mentioned in detail, yet whose courage echoes through time. As her pregnancy progressed, fear gripped her heart. She knew the decree of Pharaoh. She knew what would happen if her child was discovered. Every day, every moment, was filled with anxiety. She could not share her fear openly, could not trust anyone fully, because danger was everywhere. Yet within her heart, there was also something else, a quiet trust, a connection with Allah that would guide her through the impossible. When the time came and she gave birth, she held her child close. Imagine that moment, the warmth of a newborn in her arms, the love that fills a mother's heart, mixed with overwhelming fear. How does a mother protect her child when the entire world seems determined to destroy him? How does she find strength when every path seems blocked? And then, something extraordinary happened. Allah inspired her. Not through a voice that others could hear, but through a deep, undeniable feeling placed within her heart. She was guided to do something that no mother would ever think of on her own. She was told to place her baby in a chest, a small box, and to cast him into the river. It was a command that defied logic, defied instinct, and tested the limits of human trust. The river was vast, unpredictable, and dangerous. How could a fragile infant survive such a journey? Yet the inspiration came with a promise, a reassurance that calmed her trembling heart. Allah promised her that her child would be returned to her, and that he would be among the messengers. This was not just a test of action, it was a test of faith at its highest level. With tears in her eyes and a heart full of trust, she prepared the chest. She placed her beloved child inside, kissed him, and then, with a courage that cannot be measured, she set the chest upon the waters of the Nile. As it drifted away, she watched, her heart breaking and yet holding on to the promise of Allah. This moment, silent yet powerful, marked the beginning of a journey that would change everything. The Nile River flowed calmly that day, as if it had been commanded to carry something far more precious than water. The chest moved gently along the surface, guided not by chance, but by the will of Allah. It passed through currents, avoided dangers, and continued its journey toward a destination that no one could have predicted. This was not just a physical journey, it was a symbol of divine planning. A helpless child, placed in a fragile box, floating in a vast river, yet protected at every moment. It was a reminder that when Allah decides something, the entire universe aligns to fulfill that decision. As the chest floated, it approached the palace of Pharaoh, the very man who had ordered the death of children like him. The irony of this moment is profound. The child who was meant to be killed by Pharaoh's command was now being delivered directly into his home. Near the palace, members of the royal household noticed something unusual in the water. They retrieved the chest and brought it to the palace. When it was opened, there lay a beautiful infant, calm and untouched, as if he had been placed there moments ago. Among those present was Asiya bint Muzahim, the wife of Pharaoh. Unlike her husband, her heart was filled with compassion and faith. When she saw the child, something changed within her. She felt a deep love, a connection that could not be explained. Pharaoh saw the child as well, but where Asiya saw innocence and beauty, he saw a potential threat. Yet before he could act, Asiya spoke with wisdom and emotion. She pleaded with him not to kill the child. She suggested that they could adopt him, that he could be a comfort to them, perhaps even benefit them in the future. Pharaoh, for reasons beyond his understanding, agreed. And just like that, the child who was born under the shadow of death was now living in the safety of a palace. While all of this was happening, the mother of Musa, a.s., was living in unbearable anxiety. She had trusted Allah and let her child go, but the pain of separation weighed heavily on her. Her heart felt empty, her thoughts consumed with worry. She wondered where her child was, whether he was safe, whether she would ever see him again. Her daughter, the sister of Musa, a.s., had been watching from a distance. She followed the path of the chest, careful not to be noticed, observing everything that happened. She saw when the chest was taken into the palace, and she understood that her brother was now inside the very place that had been the source of so much fear. Meanwhile, inside the palace, a new problem arose. The infant refused to drink milk from any woman brought to feed him. They tried different wet nurses, but he would not accept any of them. This created confusion and concern within the palace. How could they care for the child if he refused to be nourished? This is where the plan of Allah unfolded in a way that left everyone amazed. The sister of Musa, a.s., stepped forward and suggested that she knew a woman who could nurse the child. She spoke carefully, hiding her true connection, and her suggestion was accepted. They brought the woman she mentioned, the mother of Musa, a.s. Imagine that moment. A mother, who had let go of her child with tears and faith, now standing before him again. The child she had feared lost forever was right in front of her. And when she held him, he accepted her immediately. He drank from her, calm and content, as if he had been waiting for this moment. The promise of Allah had been fulfilled. Not only was her child returned to her, but he was returned in a way that ensured his safety and her honor. She was even compensated for nursing him, turning her fear into a blessing. This moment stands as one of the most powerful examples of trust in Allah. When a person places their faith completely in Him, even the most impossible situations can turn into miracles. Musa, a.s., grew up in a unique environment, one that shaped his identity in extraordinary ways. On one hand, he was raised in the palace of Pharaoh, surrounded by wealth, power, and the influence of one of the greatest empires of the time. He had access to the best upbringing, the finest education, and the comfort that few could imagine. On the other hand, his roots were with the oppressed children of Israel. His true lineage connected him to a people who were suffering, who were enslaved, who were waiting for relief. This dual identity would later play a crucial role in his mission. He understood both worlds. He knew the language of power, but he also felt the pain of oppression. He was not disconnected from the struggles of his people, even though he lived among their oppressors. As he grew, signs of strength, courage, and a deep sense of justice began to appear. He was not like others in the palace. There was something different about him, something that hinted at a greater purpose. The journey had only just begun. And far beyond the walls of the palace, far beyond the flowing Nile, the destiny of Musa, a.s., was unfolding step by step, guided by the will of Allah, leading him toward a future that would challenge kings, split seas, and inspire generations to come. As the years passed, the child who had once floated helplessly upon the waters of the Nile began to grow into a young boy of striking presence and quiet strength. Inside the grand palace of Pharaoh, where golden walls reflected power and authority, Musa, a.s., was raised not as a slave, not as one among the oppressed, but as someone close to the royal household itself. He walked the same halls as rulers, observed the conduct of leaders, and witnessed firsthand the machinery of control that Pharaoh used to dominate an entire nation. Yet despite being surrounded by luxury, Musa, a.s., was never consumed by it. There was something within him that remained untouched by the glitter of wealth and the arrogance of power. His heart, though nurtured in the palace, was not shaped by its pride. It was shaped by something far deeper, something placed within him by Allah long before he could even understand it. Asiya bint Muzahim played a significant role in his upbringing. She cared for him not merely as a child brought into the palace, but with genuine love and compassion. In her presence, Musa, a.s., experienced kindness that stood in stark contrast to the cruelty that defined Pharaoh's rule. Her heart, inclined toward faith, unknowingly nurtured a future prophet within the walls of disbelief. But even within this environment, Musa, a.s., could not escape the reality outside the palace gates. Beyond the luxury of the palace lay a different world, a world filled with suffering, hardship, and injustice. The children of Israel, the descendants of Jacob, a.s., continued to live under harsh oppression. They were forced into labor, humiliated, and denied basic dignity. Their lives were controlled, their voices silenced, and their hopes crushed under the weight of Pharaoh's tyranny. As Musa, a.s., grew older, he became increasingly aware of this reality. He saw the difference between his life and theirs. He saw how they were treated, how they struggled, how they endured pain day after day. And within him, something began to awaken, a sense of justice, a deep discomfort with oppression, a refusal to accept cruelty as normal. This awareness did not come all at once. It grew slowly, like a quiet flame that becomes stronger with time. At first, it was confusion. Why were these people treated so differently? Why did they suffer while others lived in comfort? But as he matured, confusion turned into understanding, and understanding turned into conviction. He began to feel a connection to them, a bond that could not be explained by his life in the palace. It was the bond of lineage, of shared origin, of a deeper identity that could not be erased by circumstance. And this connection would soon lead him into his first major test. Musa, a.s., was not only growing in awareness but also in physical and mental strength. He became known for his powerful build, his courage, and his fearless nature. He was not someone who would turn away from conflict or injustice. When he saw wrong, he felt compelled to respond. But strength alone does not define a person. What made Musa, a.s., unique was how his strength was guided by a sense of right and wrong. He did not use his power for pride or personal gain. Instead, it was directed by an inner moral compass that Allah had placed within him. He learned from the environment around him. From the palace, he understood leadership, authority, and the behavior of those in power. From the streets, he understood struggle, pain, and the resilience of the oppressed. These two sources of knowledge combined to shape a personality that was both strong and compassionate, both bold and deeply aware. He also developed a habit of observing people closely. He noticed how Pharaoh spoke, how decisions were made, how control was maintained. But he also noticed how the oppressed communicated, how they endured, and how they held on to hope despite everything. This ability to observe would later become one of his greatest strengths, allowing him to navigate complex situations with wisdom and clarity. Yet, despite all this growth, he was still human. And like all humans, his journey would include moments of error, moments that would test him in ways he could not yet imagine. One day, Musa, a.s., decided to leave the palace and walk through the city. It was not unusual for him to move among the people, but on this particular day, something was different. The timing, the circumstances, the unseen plan of Allah, all of it was leading him toward a moment that would change his life forever. As he walked through the streets, he saw something that immediately caught his attention. Two men were fighting. One of them was from the children of Israel, and the other was an Egyptian from the people of Pharaoh. The man from Bani Israel was clearly weaker, struggling against the strength of the Egyptian. When the man from his people saw Musa, a.s., he called out to him for help. In that moment, Musa, a.s., did not hesitate. His sense of justice, his connection to the oppressed, and his natural instinct to defend the weak all came together. He stepped forward to intervene. He struck the Egyptian. But what he did not intend, what he did not expect, was that the strike would be fatal. The man fell, lifeless. Silence filled the moment. As soon as it happened, Musa, a.s., realized the gravity of what he had done. This was not what he had intended. He had only meant to stop to defend someone who was being wronged. But his strength, combined with the force of the moment, had led to a result far beyond his intention. He stood there, looking at the lifeless body, his heart filled with shock, regret, and fear. This was his first major test. He immediately turned to Allah, recognizing that this was not just a mistake, but something that required sincere repentance. He said words that came from deep within his heart, acknowledging his error and asking for forgiveness. And Allah, in His infinite mercy, forgave him. This moment is important, not because of the mistake itself, but because of the response. Musa, a.s., did not justify his action. He did not ignore it. He did not allow pride to take over. Instead, he turned to Allah with humility, accepting responsibility and seeking forgiveness. This is the mark of a true believer, and in the case of Musa, a.s., it was part of his preparation for a much greater mission. But the consequences of this moment were not over. After the incident, Musa, a.s., became cautious. He knew that if the matter became known, it could lead to serious consequences. The man he had struck was an Egyptian, and in a land ruled by Pharaoh, such an act would not be taken lightly. The next day, as he moved through the city again, he encountered the same man from Bani Israel, the one he had helped the previous day. Once again, the man was involved in a dispute, once again calling for help. But this time, Musa, reacted differently. He realized that the man was prone to conflict, that he was not always in the right. As Musa, approached, intending to intervene, the man misunderstood his intention. Thinking that Musa, might strike him as well, he spoke words that revealed something dangerous. He said, in effect, "Do you want to kill me as you killed that man yesterday?" Those words spread quickly. What had been hidden was now exposed. People began to talk. The news reached those in power. And soon, the incident that Musa, had hoped would remain unknown became a matter of serious concern. Fear began to grow. Not the fear of guilt, but the fear of what would come next. As the situation escalated, a man came running to Musa, from a distant part of the city. He was not a person of high status, but his message carried urgency and sincerity. He warned Musa, that the leaders were discussing his case, that they were planning to take action against him. He urged him to leave the city immediately. This was not a moment for hesitation. Musa, understood the seriousness of the situation. The palace that had once been his home was no longer safe. The city where he had grown up had now become a place of danger. Without delay, he made the decision to leave. Not with preparation, not with supplies, not with a clear plan, but with trust in Allah and a determination to move forward. As he stepped away from the city, leaving behind everything he had known, he made a dua, asking Allah to guide him and protect him from wrongdoing. This marked the beginning of a new phase in his life. A phase of exile, of uncertainty, of growth. The palace was behind him. The journey ahead was unknown. But the plan of Allah was unfolding perfectly, leading Musa, step by step toward the mission that would define his life. The desert stretched endlessly before him, silent and vast, as if it held secrets that only time could reveal. With every step away from the city of Egypt, Musa, felt the weight of everything he had left behind. The palace, the familiar streets, the structured life he had known, all of it faded into the distance, replaced by uncertainty and solitude. This was not a planned journey, not a prepared escape. It was a sudden departure driven by necessity, guided only by instinct and trust in Allah. There were no companions beside him, no clear destination ahead, and no provisions that could sustain him for long. The sun bore down upon him, the winds carried dust across his path, and the nights brought a silence that echoed deep within his heart. Yet, within this isolation, something profound began to take shape. Stripped of comfort, stripped of certainty, Musa, began to rely on something far greater than anything he had known before. He relied on Allah alone. Every step became an act of faith. Every breath carried a silent prayer. The man who had once walked through palace halls now walked barefoot across harsh land, feeling the reality of human vulnerability in its purest form. Hunger began to set in, thirst followed, and exhaustion crept into his body. Yet he did not turn back. There was no turning back. This was the beginning of his first true struggle, a struggle not against an enemy, but against fear, uncertainty, and the unknown. After days of travel, weakened and exhausted, Musa, finally reached a place far from the influence of Pharaoh. It was the land of Madian, a region inhabited by people who lived simpler lives, far removed from the tyranny he had escaped. As he approached the outskirts, he saw something that immediately caught his attention. There was a well. Around this well were groups of men, drawing water for their animals, talking, working, moving with ease and familiarity. But away from them, at a distance, stood two women. They were holding back their flock, waiting, not stepping forward like the others. Even in his exhausted state, Musa, noticed the difference. His sense of justice, which had already defined his earlier actions, stirred once again. He approached them, not with authority, but with concern, and asked why they were standing apart. They explained that they could not approach the well while the men were present, and that their father was old and unable to come himself. They were forced to wait until the area cleared before they could water their animals. This moment, simple as it may seem, revealed something important. Musa, even after everything he had been through, even while carrying the burden of his own problems, did not ignore the needs of others. He did not say, "I have my own struggles." He did not turn away. Instead, he stepped forward. He approached the well, used his strength, and drew water for them. What others had made difficult, he made easy. What others had ignored, he addressed without hesitation. And then, without asking for anything in return, he stepped back. This act, quiet yet powerful, marked another defining moment in his journey. After helping the women, Musa, moved away from the crowd and found a place to sit under the shade. His body was tired, his stomach empty, his future uncertain. Yet his heart turned toward Allah once again. In that moment, he made a dua that came from the deepest part of his soul. It was not a long prayer, not filled with complex words, but it carried sincerity that could move mountains. He admitted his need, his weakness, his dependence on Allah's mercy. He asked for any good that Allah would send his way. This moment of prayer is one of the most powerful in his story. It shows that even a prophet, even someone chosen for a great mission, experiences moments of vulnerability. It shows that strength does not mean independence from Allah, it means complete reliance on Him. And just as before, Allah responded. Not in a way that Musa, expected, but in a way that perfectly matched his need. Shortly after his prayer, one of the two women he had helped returned. She approached him with modesty and respect, carrying a message that would change his situation completely. She told him that her father had invited him, that he wished to reward him for helping them. This invitation was more than just a gesture of thanks. It was the beginning of stability after chaos, of comfort after hardship. Musa, accepted the invitation and followed her to their home. There, he met a man of wisdom and dignity, identified in Islamic tradition as Shuaib, Whether he was the prophet himself or a righteous elder, his character reflected wisdom, fairness, and deep understanding. Musa, shared his story honestly. He did not hide his past, did not twist the truth. He spoke of what had happened in Egypt, of the incident, of his escape, of his fear. The old man listened carefully. And then, instead of rejecting him, instead of fearing the trouble that might follow, he reassured him. He told him that he was safe now, that he had left behind the land of, and that no harm would come to him here. For the first time since leaving Egypt, Musa, felt a sense of relief. A place to rest. A place to belong. A place where he was not hunted. Life in Madian marked a turning point in the journey of Musa, From a fugitive with no direction, he now found himself in a community, under the guidance of a wise elder, with an opportunity to rebuild his life. The man offered him something remarkable. He proposed that Musa, marry one of his daughters, with the condition that he would work for him for a certain number of years. It was an offer that provided not just shelter, but dignity, responsibility, and a future. Musa, A.S., accepted. This decision was not just practical, it was part of his growth. He was no longer just reacting to events. He was building something, creating stability, learning patience, and embracing responsibility. The years that followed were not filled with dramatic events, but with quiet development. Musa, A.S., worked as a shepherd, guiding flocks, living a simple life far removed from the palace he once knew. But within this simplicity, there was profound preparation. The life of a shepherd may seem ordinary, but for Musa, A.S., it was a period of deep transformation. Guiding animals through difficult terrain, protecting them from danger, ensuring their well-being, these were not just tasks, but lessons. He learned patience. He learned how to deal with different temperaments. He learned responsibility, not for himself alone, but for those under his care. He learned how to remain calm in challenging situations. And most importantly, he learned how to lead. These were not random experiences. They were preparation for something far greater. One day, he would be responsible not for a flock, but for an entire people. The skills he developed in these quiet years would become essential in his future mission. The strength he once used in moments of impulse was now being refined into controlled, purposeful action. The man who had once acted quickly was now learning to think, to observe, to wait. This was growth. Years passed in Madian. Time, which once moved with uncertainty and fear, now flowed with stability and purpose. Musa, A.S., was no longer the young man who had fled Egypt in haste. He had matured, not just in age, but in understanding. He had experienced hardship and ease. He had made mistakes and sought forgiveness. He had lived in luxury and in simplicity. He had been alone and had found companionship. All of these experiences combined to shape a personality that was ready for something greater. Yet, despite the peace he found in Madian, his journey was not meant to end there. There was a mission waiting for him. A mission that would take him back to the very place he had fled. A mission that would put him face to face with Pharaoh once again. A mission that would challenge the most powerful ruler of his time. But before that mission could begin, there would be a moment unlike any other, a moment of divine encounter, a moment that would mark the transition from preparation to purpose. And that moment was drawing near, hidden within the quiet passage of time, waiting for the exact moment when Musa, A.S., would be ready to receive it. Time had moved gently yet steadily in the land of Madian, and the years of service that Musa, A.S., had committed himself to were now coming to an end. The quiet life he had built, the family he had formed, and the peace he had experienced had all shaped him into someone far different from the young man who had once fled Egypt in fear. He was no longer running away from something, he was now being prepared to move towards something. There comes a time in every great journey when comfort must be left behind, when the calm must give way to calling, and when a person must step into the unknown once again. For Musa, A.S., that moment arrived when he decided to return toward Egypt. It was not a decision made lightly. Egypt was not just a place from his past, it was the land where he had once faced danger, the place where a mistake had forced him into exile, and the home of a ruler whose power remained unchallenged. Yet something within him urged him forward. Perhaps it was a sense of unfinished destiny, perhaps it was a quiet calling placed within his heart by Allah. Whatever it was, Musa, A.S., gathered his family, prepared for the journey, and began the long return across the desert. The path ahead was uncertain. The land was harsh, the nights cold, and the journey demanding. But this time, he was not alone. He carried with him not just his family, but years of growth, patience, and understanding. He was no longer the same man who had once walked these paths in fear. He was being guided. As Musa, traveled with his family, there came a night that would forever stand apart from all others. The desert was silent, the sky stretched endlessly above, and the cold darkness surrounded them. It was a moment where the world seemed still, as if waiting for something extraordinary to unfold. In the distance, Musa, noticed something unusual. A fire. It flickered in the darkness, a small yet clear source of light in the vast emptiness of the desert. For a traveler, fire meant warmth, direction, and perhaps even the presence of others. It was a sign of hope in the cold night. Turning to his family, Musa, told them to stay where they were. He would go toward the fire, perhaps to bring back a burning branch for warmth, or to find guidance for the path ahead. With steady steps, he moved toward it. But this was no ordinary fire. This was the moment that would change everything. As Musa, approached the fire, he entered a place unlike any he had ever experienced. The atmosphere shifted. The air felt different. The ground beneath his feet carried a sense of sacredness that could not be explained in words. This was the Valley of Tuwa. And in this sacred place, Musa, experienced something that no human experience could fully describe. He heard a voice. Not a voice like any other, not one that came from a person or echoed through the air in a familiar way. It was a voice that reached him directly, a voice filled with authority, power, and undeniable truth. It was the voice of Allah. In that moment, Musa, was called by name. The one who had created him, who had guided him from the moment he was placed in the river, who had protected him through every stage of his life, was now speaking to him directly. Allah commanded him to remove his sandals, for he was in a sacred valley. Imagine the intensity of that moment. The realization that the ground beneath him was holy, that the space he stood in was chosen, that the moment he was living was beyond anything he had ever known. Musa, obeyed without hesitation. This was not just a moment of awe. It was a moment of transformation. In that sacred space, Allah revealed to Musa, something that would define his entire existence. He had been chosen. Chosen as a messenger. Chosen to carry a message of truth. Chosen to stand against tyranny. Chosen to guide a people who had been oppressed for generations. This was not a role that Musa, had sought. It was not something he had planned or imagined. But every moment of his life, every struggle, every experience, had been leading to this point. Allah introduced himself as the Lord of all that exists, the one who alone deserves worship. This was the core of the message that Musa, would carry, the message of Tawheed, the oneness of Allah. And then came the command that would shape the next phase of his life. He was to go to Pharaoh. The very man he had once fled. The most powerful ruler of the land. The one who claimed to be a god. Musa, was to stand before him and deliver the message of truth. To strengthen him for this immense task, Allah granted Musa, miracles, clear signs that would support him in his mission and demonstrate the truth of his message. He was told to throw down his staff. When he did, it transformed into a serpent, moving with life and power. The sight was overwhelming, causing Musa, to step back in fear. But Allah reassured him, commanding him to take it again, and when he did, it returned to its original form. This was a sign. A sign that what he carried was not ordinary. A sign that Allah's power was beyond anything that could be imagined. Then, he was instructed to place his hand into his garment. When he brought it out, it shone with a bright, radiant light, free from any harm. Another sign. These miracles were not just displays of power. They were tools, given to Musa, as, to support him in a mission that would challenge the strongest forces of his time. Despite the honor of being chosen, Musa, as, felt the weight of the responsibility placed upon him. He knew the reality of Pharaoh's power. He knew the danger of standing against him. He knew the challenges that lay ahead. In that moment, he did something that shows the humanity within even the greatest of prophets. He expressed his concerns. He spoke honestly to Allah, asking for support, for ease, for strength. He asked for his chest to be expanded, for his task to be made easy, for clarity in his speech so that his message could be understood. And then, he made a specific request. He asked that his brother, Harun, as, be made his partner in this mission. He knew his own strengths and his own limitations. He knew that his brother had qualities that would complement his own. This was not weakness. This was wisdom. And Allah, in His mercy, accepted his request. Harun, as, would join him. He would not face this mission alone. With this divine encounter, everything changed. The journey that had begun as a return to a familiar land had now become something far greater. It was no longer just a physical journey. It was a mission. Musa, as, returned to his family, but he was no longer the same man who had left them moments before. He carried with him a message, a purpose, a connection with Allah that would guide every step he took from that point onward. The road ahead would not be easy. He would face rejection, resistance, and confrontation. He would stand before a ruler who saw himself as untouchable. He would call an entire nation toward truth. But he would not do so alone. Allah would be with him. And so, with his brother by his side and divine support behind him, Musa, as, began the journey back toward Egypt once again, not as a fugitive, but as a messenger. The turning point had come. The man who once fled in fear was now returning with courage. The one who once sought safety was now stepping into danger with purpose. And the story that had begun with a child in a river was now unfolding into a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of power itself. The journey back toward Egypt carried a weight unlike any other journey Musa, as, had ever taken. The land that once symbolized fear, exile, and escape now stood before him as the stage of his mission. But this time, he was not returning in secrecy, nor was he guided by fear. He was returning with certainty, with a message that came directly from Allah, and with a purpose that no power on earth could stop. Beside him was his brother, Harun, as, a companion not only in blood but in mission. Where Musa, as, carried intensity and strength, Harun, as, carried clarity and calmness. Together, they formed a balance that would prove essential in the trials to come. As they approached the boundaries of Egypt, memories must have returned to Musa, as, memories of his childhood in the palace, of the streets where he once walked freely, and of the moment that forced him into exile. But these memories did not weaken him. Instead, they reminded him of the journey he had taken, the transformation he had undergone, and the truth he now carried. The time had come to stand before Pharaoh. The time had come to speak. Entering the palace once again, Musa, as, stood in a place that had once been familiar. The grand halls, the towering pillars, the atmosphere of authority, it was all the same. But everything had changed. He was no longer a member of this world. He was now its challenger. Pharaoh sat upon his throne, surrounded by his court, his advisors, and the symbols of his power. To them, Musa, as, was a man who had once lived among them, who had disappeared, and who had now returned. But they could not yet understand the true nature of his return. With calmness and courage, Musa, as, delivered the message. He called Pharaoh to worship Allah alone. He reminded him of his place as a human, not a god. He invited him to truth, to justice, to humility. These were not words that Pharaoh was used to hearing. No one spoke to him in this way. No one challenged his authority, his claims, his identity. Pharaoh's reaction was not one of reflection. It was one of arrogance. He questioned Musa, as, reminding him of his past, of how he had been raised in the palace, of how he had committed a killing before fleeing. He attempted to use Musa's history against him, to weaken his position, to turn the focus away from the message. But Musa, as, did not deny his past. He acknowledged it. He admitted his mistake, clarified his intention, and then redirected the conversation to what truly mattered, the message from Allah. This moment revealed something powerful. Truth does not depend on perfection of the past. It depends on sincerity in the present. Pharaoh, unable to accept the message yet unwilling to ignore it completely, demanded proof. He wanted to see something that would validate Musa's claim, something that would convince him, or at least challenge him. And so, Musa, as, presented the signs that Allah had given him. He threw down his staff. Before the eyes of Pharaoh and his court, it transformed into a living serpent, moving with undeniable reality. This was not an illusion, not a trick, not something that could be explained by ordinary means. Then he showed his hand. When he drew it out, it shone with a bright, radiant light, a sign that could not be denied. The court was shaken. The people watching were stunned. But Pharaoh did not accept it. Instead, he did what many who fear truth often do, he denied it and reframed it. He accused Musa, as, of being a magician. Not just any magician, but a skilled one, someone who had come to challenge the established order using tricks and deception. This accusation was strategic. Magic was known in Egypt. Magicians held influence. By labeling Musa, as a magician, Pharaoh aimed to reduce his message to something familiar, something that could be controlled, something that could be defeated. And so, he proposed a confrontation. Pharaoh announced that he would gather the best magicians from across the land. These were not ordinary individuals. They were masters of illusion, experts in deception, people who had spent years perfecting their craft. A day was chosen. A place was prepared. A large gathering was organized. People from across Egypt were invited to witness the event. It was not just a challenge, it was a spectacle. Pharaoh wanted to demonstrate his power, to show that anyone who challenged him would be defeated publicly. The magicians arrived, confident in their abilities, assured of their skills, and motivated by the promise of reward. They even asked Pharaoh if they would be rewarded if they succeeded, and he promised them not just reward, but closeness to him. This was their moment. But they did not yet understand what they were truly facing. The day of the confrontation arrived. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Crowds gathered, eager to witness the outcome. At the center stood Musa, as, and Harun, as, calm yet firm, carrying the message of truth. Opposite them stood the magicians, prepared, confident, ready to display their skills. The challenge began. The magicians cast their ropes and staffs, and through their techniques, they created the illusion of movement. To the eyes of the people, it appeared as though snakes were moving across the ground. It was impressive. It was convincing. It was exactly what Pharaoh had hoped for. For a brief moment, even Musa, as, felt a natural human reaction, a sense of concern at the sight before him. But then came the command from Allah. He was told to throw his staff. And when he did, everything changed. The staff transformed into a serpent, not an illusion, not a trick, but a real, living creature. It moved with power and purpose, consuming everything the magicians had created. In a single moment, the difference became clear. This was not magic. This was truth. This was divine. The magicians saw it. They understood it. They recognized that what Musa, a.s., had brought was not something that could be matched by their skills. They had spent their lives mastering illusion, and they knew the difference between illusion and reality. Without hesitation, they fell in front of Pharaoh. In front of the crowd. They declared their belief in the Lord of Musa, a.s., and Harun, a.s. This was a moment of immense significance. The very people who had been brought to defeat Musa, a.s., were now affirming his truth. The spectacle that Pharaoh had organized to demonstrate his power had turned into a demonstration of his weakness. But Pharaoh's reaction was not acceptance. It was fury. Pharaoh was enraged. He saw the belief of the magicians not as a realization of truth, but as a threat to his authority. He accused them of conspiracy, claiming that they had secretly aligned with Musa, a.s. And then, he issued a punishment that reflected the depth of his. He threatened to cut off their hands and feet from opposite sides. He threatened to crucify them. He wanted to make an example of them, to show that belief in anything other than him would be met with severe consequences. But the magicians did not waver. Moments ago, they had been servants of Pharaoh. Now, they were believers in Allah. They declared that they would not return to disbelief, no matter what punishment awaited them. They accepted the consequences, confident in their faith, certain in their choice. This transformation, so sudden yet so firm, demonstrated the power of truth when it is recognized sincerely. This moment marked the true beginning of the rise of Musa, a.s. The message had been delivered, the signs had been shown, and the first group of believers had emerged, even from among those who had stood against him. But this was only the beginning. Pharaoh's resistance would grow stronger. The challenges would become greater. The confrontation between truth and falsehood would intensify. Yet, the foundation had been set. The man who once fled in fear had now stood before the most powerful ruler of his time and delivered the message of Allah without hesitation. The journey from obscurity to prominence was complete. And now, the real struggle was about to unfold. The rise had begun. As the message of Allah continued to spread through the land of Egypt, the conflict between truth and arrogance began to intensify in ways that could no longer be ignored. The confrontation that had begun in the royal court of Pharaoh was no longer a single event. It had become a living reality affecting every level of society. Musa, a.s., and Harun, a.s., continued to deliver the message with patience and clarity. They called people away from worship of creation and toward the worship of the Creator alone. They reminded them that Pharaoh was not a god, but a human being bound by the same limits as everyone else. They spoke of justice, of freedom, of returning to the path of truth that had been revealed by Allah to all earlier generations. But the response from Pharaoh's system was not acceptance. It was resistance. The rulers of Egypt began to feel that their entire structure of control was being threatened. The message of Musa, a.s., did not merely challenge religious beliefs, it challenged the foundation of political authority, social hierarchy, and inherited power. If people began to believe in one God and reject the authority of Pharaoh, then the entire system of oppression would begin to collapse. So Pharaoh responded the only way he knew how. With pressure. with control, with increasing. The first to feel the consequences of this growing tension were the children of Israel, the people of Jacob, as. Under Pharaoh's rule, their suffering increased. They were already oppressed, but now the oppression became more systematic, more intense, and more humiliating. They were forced into harder labor. Their conditions worsened. Their voices were further silenced. The intention was clear, to break their spirit so that they would abandon the message of Musa, as, and return to obedience to Pharaoh. Fear spread among the people. Many began to question whether following Musa, as, would bring them relief or more hardship. Some believed in him secretly, while others hesitated, caught between hope and fear. Musa, as, reassured them with patience. He reminded them that Allah's promise is true, even if the path appears long. He told them that relief does not always come immediately, but it always comes when patience and faith are maintained. Yet the pressure did not stop. It increased. As Pharaoh continued his rejection, Allah began to send signs upon Egypt. These were not random disasters. They were precise, meaningful events meant to awaken the people and expose the weakness of Pharaoh's claim to power. The first of these signs was drought. The land of Egypt, which had always been blessed by the Nile, began to experience shortages. Crops failed. Water became less fruitful. The abundance that people had taken for granted began to diminish. It was a reminder that sustenance does not come from rulers, but from Allah alone. When the hardship became severe, the people rushed to Pharaoh and sought relief. They begged him to intervene. Pharaoh, in his arrogance, would sometimes promise that if relief came, they would acknowledge his authority. But when the hardship was lifted, they returned to their denial. This cycle continued. Hardship would come. People would plead. Relief would follow. Denial would return. This pattern revealed something important about human nature. When it is detached from truth, it fluctuates between fear and forgetfulness. But the signs were not over. The signs intensified. Swarms of locusts appeared, consuming what remained of crops. Insects spread across the land. Water sources became affected. Floods and unusual natural disturbances shook the stability of daily life. Each sign carried a message, that control does not belong to Pharaoh, but to Allah alone. Each time a sign came, the people would run to Musa, as, and ask him to pray to Allah for relief. And each time relief came, many of them would return to their previous ways. This repeated turning away after clarity is what made their situation even more serious. Pharaoh, however, refused to change. His arrogance was not reduced by signs, it was reinforced by denial. He continued to present himself as the ultimate authority, insisting that everything happening was either coincidence or a challenge that could be overcome through human effort. But the truth was becoming clearer with every passing event. After many signs had been shown, Musa, as, delivered a final message to Pharaoh. He called him once again to believe in Allah, to free the children of Israel, and to end the oppression that had defined his rule. But Pharaoh's response remained the same. He rejected the message and demanded further proof, even though proof had already been given repeatedly. At this point, the situation reached its final stage. The time for gradual signs was ending. The time for decisive action was approaching. Allah revealed to Musa, as, that he should lead the children of Israel out of Egypt by night. This was not an escape born of fear, but a divinely guided departure. It marked the beginning of the end of Pharaoh's authority over them. Musa, as, gathered his people quietly. There was urgency, but also trust. The promise of Allah was that they would be protected. And so, under the cover of night, they began their journey. When Pharaoh discovered that the children of Israel had left, his reaction was immediate and furious. He could not allow what he considered his property to leave. He gathered his armies and set out in pursuit. The land of Egypt, once a place of oppression and silence, now became a place of movement and urgency. One group moved toward freedom, while another moved in pursuit of control. Musa, as, led his people toward the sea. Behind them, the sound of approaching forces grew closer. Fear began to rise among the children of Israel. They looked at the sea ahead and the army behind them and felt trapped. They cried out that they had been caught. But Musa, as, responded with certainty that did not come from human confidence, but from divine assurance. He declared that Allah was with them, and that they would be guided. This moment marked one of the most intense points in the entire journey. The sea ahead. The army behind. And faith in between. As Pharaoh's army drew near, Musa, as, received a command from Allah. He was instructed to strike the sea with his staff. When he did, something beyond human comprehension occurred. The waters of the sea divided, forming pathways on both sides. The ground beneath became visible, and a dry passage appeared where moments before there had been only water. This was not a coincidence of nature. It was a direct manifestation of divine power. Musa, as, led his people forward into the path. The children of Israel crossed through the sea, walking between walls of water that stood like barriers on either side. The experience must have been overwhelming, fear, awe, and disbelief all merging into one moment. Behind them, Pharaoh and his army followed, entering the same path, convinced that they were still in control. But control does not belong to those who pursue arrogance. It belongs to Allah alone. As the last of the children of Israel crossed safely, and as Pharaoh's army reached the middle of the path, the command came once again. The waters that had been held apart began to return to their natural state. The sea collapsed upon itself. The path disappeared. And Pharaoh and his army were overwhelmed by the very force they had just walked through with confidence. In that moment, the reality that had been denied for so long became undeniable. Pharaoh, who had claimed divinity, now faced the limits of his own humanity. At the moment of his end, he realized the truth, but realization at the point of death cannot undo a lifetime of arrogance. The sea became his end. And the children of Israel witnessed their liberation. On the other side of the sea, silence fell over the children of Israel. They had escaped. The oppression they had known for generations was finally broken. The system that had controlled them for so long had been destroyed. Musa, as, stood among them, not as a ruler, but as a messenger who had fulfilled his duty. The journey was not over, but a major chapter had come to its conclusion. The rise had reached its peak. Not in power, but in truth. The truth had stood against falsehood. And falsehood had fallen. But as with every major victory, new challenges would soon emerge. Because liberation is not the end of struggle, it is the beginning of a new form of responsibility. And the story of Musa, as, was still far from over. The moment the waters of the sea closed over the forces of Pharaoh, silence fell upon the land in a way no one had ever experienced before. The air itself felt different, as if the world had just witnessed something so powerful that it could never return to what it once was. On one side stood destruction, on the other stood survival. And in the middle of it all stood Musa, as, leading a people who had just been pulled out of centuries of oppression into the uncertainty of freedom. But freedom, as they were about to learn, is not a simple gift. It is a responsibility. It is a test in a different form. The children of Israel, who had cried for relief under the weight of Pharaohs, now found themselves in a new kind of struggle, one that would test not their chains, but their hearts. The desert beyond the sea was vast and unfamiliar. There were no palaces, no structured cities, no systems of provision that they had once known in Egypt. There was only open land, silence, and the unknown will of Allah guiding them forward. And in this silence, human nature began to reveal itself. As days passed, the initial shock of liberation slowly began to fade. The children of Israel, descendants of Yaqub, a.s., began to feel the difficulty of their new reality. In Egypt, they had suffered under oppression, but they had also known structure. They had known food distribution, even if controlled. They had known shelter, even if forced. Now, in the open land, they were faced with a life that required complete trust in Allah without visible systems around them. Hunger began to appear. Fear began to grow. Questions began to rise. Why were they taken into the desert? Where was the food? Where was the comfort they had hoped for after escape? These questions were not born from disbelief alone, but from weakness, from human impatience, from a heart that struggles to remain steady when conditions change too quickly. Musa, a.s., continued to remind them that Allah's promise is always true. He told them that what they were experiencing was not abandonment, but preparation. That the same Lord who had parted the sea for them would not leave them without guidance now. But not everyone was patient. Despite their liberation, the mindset of slavery had not fully left the hearts of many among the children of Israel. Centuries under Pharaoh had shaped their habits, expectations, and emotional responses. Even after physical freedom, mental dependence remained. They began to compare their present with their past. In Egypt, they said, at least we knew what we would eat. In the desert, they said, we do not know what tomorrow will bring. This comparison revealed a deep truth: oppression does not only restrict the body, it reshapes perception. Freedom requires not just escape from tyranny, but transformation of mindset. And this transformation would take time. During this period, Allah continued to provide for them in ways they did not fully appreciate. But instead of gratitude, many expressed dissatisfaction. Instead of patience, they expressed complaint. And slowly, these complaints began to take more serious forms. At one point, the people approached Musa, a.s., with a strange request. They asked for food that resembled what they had known in Egypt. They mentioned familiar items, foods from their past life under Pharaoh. It was not just hunger they were expressing, but emotional attachment to their former state, even if that state had been filled with oppression. This moment revealed something deeply human: people often romanticize their suffering when the present feels uncertain. Musa, a.s., responded with clarity. He reminded them that they were being given something better, something pure, something directly provided by Allah. But their hearts were not yet ready to fully recognize this. This tension between divine provision and human impatience would continue to define much of their journey. Eventually, the group arrived at a place of significance, the mountain of Sinai. Here, a major moment in their collective journey would take place. Musa, a.s., was commanded to ascend the mountain for communication with Allah, leaving his people behind temporarily under the care of his brother Harun, a.s. This separation would become a critical test for the community. Before leaving, Musa, a.s., instructed them to remain steadfast, to avoid deviation, and to remain patient until he returned with guidance. But human weakness, especially when not fully anchored in faith, often surfaces in the absence of leadership. And that is exactly what happened. During Musa, a.s., absence, a man among the people, later known in tradition as the one who misled them, began to sow confusion. He exploited their impatience, their fear, and their lack of spiritual grounding. He introduced something foreign into their belief system, something that contradicted everything they had just been taught about pure worship of Allah. Gradually, under influence and confusion, a portion of the people deviated. They created and followed an idol, a physical representation they could see and touch, abandoning the unseen faith they had been commanded to hold. This was not just a mistake of intellect, it was a collapse of trust. When Musa, a.s., returned from the mountain, carrying revelation and guidance, he was met with a reality that shook him deeply. The people who had just been saved from one form of falsehood had now fallen into another. And this moment marked the beginning of one of the most painful phases of his entire journey. Musa, a.s., returned with the divine message, expecting to find his people united in gratitude and patience. Instead, he found division, confusion, and deviation from the path he had left them upon. The emotional weight of this moment was immense. He had struggled, faced Pharaoh, led them through the sea, and guided them toward freedom. Yet here they were, turning away so quickly from the very foundation of their liberation. His reaction was not just anger, it was sorrow. Deep sorrow. The kind that comes when effort meets betrayal, when guidance meets rejection, when truth is abandoned despite clear signs. He turned to his brother Harun, a.s., questioning how this could have happened in his absence. Harun, a.s., explained that he had tried to guide them, to restrain them, but the people had grown stubborn and overwhelming in their demands. This was not a failure of one man. It was a test of an entire community. This phase of the journey reveals a recurring pattern in human behavior. The same people who witness miracles, who experience salvation, who see divine intervention with their own eyes, can still fall into doubt when tested with time, patience, and absence of immediate guidance. It is not that they lacked evidence. It is that they lacked consistency. Faith is not proven only in moments of crisis. It is tested in moments of waiting. The children of Israel had crossed the sea, seen the destruction of Pharaoh, and experienced direct signs of Allah's power. Yet their hearts were still in need of purification, still shaped by years of dependence and fear. And Musa, a.s., as their leader and messenger, now faced the responsibility of correcting not just actions, but hearts. What followed was not a simple confrontation, but a process of reform, accountability, and restoration. Musa, a.s., called his people back to clarity, reminding them of the covenant they had accepted, the signs they had witnessed, and the mercy they had been shown. This stage of the journey was not about external enemies anymore. It was about internal discipline. About rebuilding faith from within. About transforming a freed people into a believing nation. And this would require patience, repetition, and continuous guidance. The story was no longer about escape. It was about survival after escape. And the most difficult battles were still ahead. After the painful revelation of deviation among his people, the heart of Musa, a.s., carried a weight that few could imagine. The journey that had begun with liberation from Pharaoh had now entered a far more complex stage. Physical freedom had been achieved, but spiritual stability was still fragile. The children of Israel, descendants of Yaqub, a.s., were now facing the consequences of impatience, confusion, and weak faith. When Musa, a.s., confronted them, it was not merely a moment of anger. It was a moment of heartbreak. The people who had witnessed the sea split before their eyes, who had seen the downfall of Pharaoh, who had experienced direct signs of Allah's mercy, had still been misled in his absence. This revealed a deep truth about human nature, that belief is not only about witnessing miracles, but about remaining firm when tests come without visible signs. Yet even in this moment of disappointment, Musa, a.s., did not abandon his people. His mission was not only to deliver them from oppression, but to guide them toward stability in faith. So after addressing the deviation, he turned toward correction. He began the process of rebuilding what had been broken. And this marked the beginning of what can be called his evolution as a leader, not just a messenger of liberation, but a guide for spiritual reform. Musa, a.s., once again ascended to receive revelation from Allah. This was not his first communication, but now it carried an added depth of responsibility. The people he led were in need of structure, clarity, and a renewed covenant with Allah. In this sacred interaction, guidance was revealed in the form of commandments, clear principles that would shape the moral and spiritual foundation of his community. These teachings were not meant only for rituals, but for life itself: justice, honesty, worship of Allah alone, and the rejection of oppression in all its forms. These instructions were not abstract ideas. They were meant to rebuild a broken society. When Musa, a.s., returned, he carried with him something that symbolized divine order and law. The message was clear: freedom without guidance leads to chaos, but freedom grounded in divine instruction leads to stability. And yet, even with this renewed guidance, the journey was far from stable. The deviation that had occurred in the absence of Musa, a.s., could not be ignored. The people had to understand the seriousness of turning away after clear signs. Accountability became part of their spiritual rehabilitation. Musa, a.s., addressed them with firmness but also with purpose. He reminded them that their liberation from Pharaoh was not the end of their responsibility, but the beginning of it. Allah had saved them not to leave them aimless, but to guide them toward a higher moral order. The people, now confronted with the reality of their actions, began to feel remorse. Some among them realized their mistake deeply and turned back in repentance. This moment of return was significant, because it showed that even after deviation, the door to mercy was still open. Allah's mercy, as revealed through Musa, a.s., was not limited by human failure. But it required sincerity, acknowledgement, and correction. And so, the community began to slowly rebuild itself under renewed guidance. However, the consequences of their instability were not removed immediately. The children of Israel were still in a transitional state between oppression and establishment. They were not yet settled in a permanent homeland. Instead, they were led through a period of wandering in the land. This phase was not meaningless. It was a period of purification, training, and spiritual development. A generation that had been shaped by slavery needed time to transform into a people capable of responsibility and faith. During this time, Allah provided for them in ways that reminded them of His mercy even in hardship. Sustenance came to them in unexpected ways. Guidance continued through Musa, a.s., and leadership remained firm through his brother Harun, a.s. But the wandering also exposed ongoing weaknesses. Complaints continued. Comparisons with their past life in Egypt persisted. The struggle between gratitude and impatience remained constant. Yet through all of this, Musa, a.s., remained patient. His role had evolved beyond confrontation with Pharaoh. Now he was shaping a community, correcting behavior, and nurturing faith over time. This stage of the journey reveals the true nature of prophetic leadership. It is not defined only by moments of victory, but by long periods of patience, correction, and emotional endurance. Musa, a.s., was no longer only confronting external tyranny. That phase had ended with the downfall of Pharaoh. Now he was confronting something more complex: internal instability. The challenge of guiding people after liberation is often greater than the challenge of freeing them. Because freedom exposes character. It reveals whether hearts are truly anchored in truth or only reacting to oppression. Musa, a.s., had to constantly remind, correct, and guide. He had to balance firmness with compassion, authority with mercy, and truth with patience. This was his evolution, from liberator to builder of faith. One of the recurring themes during this period was forgetfulness. The people would witness provision and then question it. They would experience relief and then complain again. They would receive guidance and then waver. Musa, a.s., repeatedly reminded them that gratitude is not just a feeling, but a discipline. It requires remembering the past, acknowledging present blessings, and trusting the future. Their journey was filled with signs meant to anchor this understanding. But human weakness often turns clarity into confusion when patience is lacking. This constant cycle of remembrance and forgetfulness became one of the central struggles of their time in the wilderness. Among the children of Israel emerged a figure whose story would become a warning for all generations, Pharaoh. Pharaoh was granted immense wealth. His treasures were so vast that even the keys to his storage became a burden for strong men to carry. But instead of using this blessing with humility and gratitude, he allowed it to become a source of arrogance. He began to attribute his wealth to his own knowledge and ability. He distanced himself from the reminder that all provision comes from Allah. And as his arrogance grew, so did his distance from the moral teachings brought by Musa, a.s. The people watched him with mixed feelings. Some admired his wealth, while others warned against his arrogance. Musa, a.s., reminded him and others that success without humility leads to destruction. But Pharaoh refused to listen. His story became a symbol of how corruption can arise not only from oppression, but from within a community itself when wealth is not balanced with faith. Eventually, the consequences of his arrogance became visible in a way that shocked everyone around him. His wealth and status could not protect him when the decree of Allah arrived. The earth itself became a witness to his end. And the community learned a powerful lesson: power and wealth are temporary, but accountability is eternal. With each event, deviation, correction, provision, warning, the children of Israel were slowly being shaped into a community capable of carrying responsibility. This process was not quick, and it was not easy. It required repeated guidance from Musa, a.s., patience from Harun, a.s., and continuous mercy from Allah. They were learning that faith is not a single decision, but a continuous journey. Musa, a.s., in this phase of his life, had fully transitioned into his role as a reformer. He was no longer only confronting external enemies or delivering initial messages. He was now deeply involved in shaping identity, correcting behavior, and establishing a foundation for future generations. His evolution was complete in this stage, from child of the river, to palace survivor, to exile, to messenger, to liberator, and now to builder of a community. And yet, the journey was still not over. Because even after correction, trials would continue. And even after growth, challenges would remain. But the foundation had been laid. A nation was being shaped. And the legacy of Musa, a.s., was becoming not just a story of escape, but a story of transformation. The years of wandering had done what no single event could achieve. They had slowly reshaped a people. The children of Israel, descendants of Jacob, a.s., were no longer the same community that had once lived under the crushing system of Pharaoh. They were no longer physically enslaved, but they were still in the process of being freed internally, freed from habits of fear, dependency, and emotional instability. At the center of this long transformation stood Musa, a.s., carrying not only the message of Allah but also the burden of shaping an entire generation. This was not a mission of short victories. It was a mission of long patience. The liberation from Egypt had been a moment of divine power, but building a stable community required constant guidance, correction, and endurance. Over time, something profound began to emerge. A new identity was being formed, an identity built not on oppression or nostalgia for Egypt, but on covenant, responsibility, and divine instruction. Yet this identity was fragile. It required constant reinforcement through reminders, revelation, and lived experience. And so the journey continued, not through dramatic external events alone, but through the slow shaping of hearts. Among the most defining moments in this phase was the establishment of a covenant between Allah and the people through Musa, a.s. This covenant was not symbolic. It was foundational. It defined the relationship between the Creator and the community being shaped under prophetic guidance. They were reminded that guidance is not passive. It demands action, discipline, and sincerity. Worship of Allah alone was not simply a belief, it was a complete way of life that affected justice, behavior, honesty, and social responsibility. This covenant also made something clear: blessings come with accountability. Freedom is not meaningless, it is structured by moral law. Without this structure, freedom turns into confusion. With it, freedom becomes dignity. Musa, a.s., delivered these truths with patience, even when the people struggled to remain consistent. He did not abandon them when they faltered. Instead, he continued to guide them back to clarity. And yet, despite all reminders, the human heart continued to be tested. There came a moment when Musa, a.s., once again withdrew for a deeper period of reflection and communication with Allah. This was not unusual, but each ascent carried new weight, because each return revealed new challenges among his people. During these moments, divine guidance continued to shape the moral structure of the community. Instructions were given, laws were clarified, and the foundation of ethical living was strengthened. These teachings were not meant only for the present generation but for future generations who would look back at this moment as a source of guidance. But while divine guidance was being revealed at the highest level, the people below were still struggling with consistency. This contrast between revelation and human behavior became one of the defining tensions of their journey. Even after witnessing miracles, receiving provision, and experiencing liberation, the children of Israel continued to display patterns of instability. Their reactions often shifted between gratitude and complaint, between trust and doubt. This was not a failure of message, but a reflection of the difficulty of internal transformation. A people shaped by centuries of external control does not become internally stable overnight. Musa, a.s., understood this reality deeply. His leadership was not based on frustration alone, but on recognition of human psychology and divine wisdom. He knew that transformation requires time, repetition, and patience. Still, the emotional burden of guiding such a people was immense. Every deviation required correction. Every complaint required response. Every moment of confusion required clarity. And through it all, he remained committed. The story of Karen continued to serve as a powerful reminder within the community. His downfall had already demonstrated the danger of arrogance and material obsession, but its lessons were continuously reflected upon by the people. Some remembered it with sincerity, recognizing the danger of pride. Others treated it as a distant story, forgetting its relevance to their own behavior. This difference in response revealed a deeper truth: lessons only benefit those who reflect upon them consistently. Musa, a.s., emphasized that wealth, status, and worldly success are not measures of true honor. True honor lies in humility, obedience to Allah, and responsibility toward others. This message was not easy for everyone to accept, especially in a community still learning balance. But over time, it became part of their moral awareness. As years passed, a natural transition began to take shape. The generation that had directly experienced Egypt, slavery, and the initial liberation began to age. A new generation, born during or after the wandering period, started to emerge. This new generation did not carry the same memories of Pharaoh's oppression. Instead, they inherited stories, teachings, and lessons. Their identity was being shaped not by direct trauma, but by inherited guidance. This shift created both opportunity and challenge. On one hand, the new generation had the potential to build a more stable identity. On the other hand, without first-hand experience of oppression, they risked underestimating the importance of obedience and gratitude. Musa, A.S., had to adapt his leadership once again. He was now not only correcting past behaviors but also shaping future understanding. This is where prophetic leadership reveals its deepest dimension. It is not limited to one era, but spans generations. By this stage, Musa, A.S., had fulfilled multiple roles within one lifetime. He had been a child saved from destruction, a youth raised in a palace, a man who fled in exile, a traveler in hardship, a servant in simplicity, a messenger of revelation, a liberator of a nation, and a guide shaping an entire community. Each stage of his life was not separate, it was connected. Every hardship prepared him for responsibility. Every moment of loss prepared him for leadership. Every act of patience prepared him for endurance. His story is not one of sudden greatness, but of gradual formation under divine guidance. And through all of this, the central message remained constant: worship Allah alone, reject oppression, and live with justice and patience. From a broader perspective, the story of Musa, A.S., is not only about one man or one community. It is about the transformation of human civilization under divine guidance. It demonstrates how belief systems shape societies, how leadership shapes identity, and how patience shapes destiny. The downfall of Pharaoh was not just a political event, it was a declaration that arrogance has limits. The survival of the children of Israel was not just physical, it was the beginning of moral responsibility. The journey through the wilderness was not just geographical, it was psychological and spiritual refinement. And through it all, Musa, A.S., remained the anchor of truth, continuously guiding his people toward stability. As the narrative moved toward its later stages, the legacy of Musa, A.S., began to take clearer form. He was not remembered only as a liberator from Egypt, but as a foundational figure in the establishment of divine law, moral responsibility, and monotheistic faith. His life demonstrated that true leadership is not defined by immediate success, but by consistent dedication to truth over time. It also demonstrated that the most difficult part of leadership is not confronting enemies, but guiding followers after victory. The children of Israel continued their journey under guidance, and the lessons they learned during this period would echo through generations. But even as this chapter of transformation neared its conclusion, one final stage remained. A stage of completion. A stage of closure. A stage that would define the final footprint of Musa, A.S., in history. And that stage was yet to come. The journey of Musa, A.S., had stretched across decades, shaping not only his own life but the destiny of an entire community. By this final stage, the children of Israel, descendants of Yaqub, A.S., had already passed through liberation, wandering, correction, and gradual spiritual rebuilding. The echoes of Egypt had begun to fade, and the shadow of Pharaoh was no longer a living reality, but a historical lesson. Yet even in this later stage, the mission of Musa, A.S., had not become easy. Leadership never becomes light when responsibility is divine. The people continued to require guidance, reminders, and correction. Generations had shifted, hearts had changed, and yet the need for consistency in faith remained constant. Musa, a.s., had become more than a leader of escape or a messenger of confrontation. He had become the foundation of a moral nation being shaped under divine instruction. His life was no longer measured in moments of victory alone, but in the slow and steady construction of belief across time. And as his journey reached its final phase, something deeper emerged, not a new mission, but the completion of a trust that had been carried since the day he first heard the voice from the sacred valley. Every messenger carries a trust that is not personal, it belongs to Allah. That trust is to deliver, to guide, and to remain steadfast in truth regardless of resistance. Musa, a.s., had fulfilled that trust in stages, in Egypt, in exile, in revelation, in confrontation, and in leadership. By this point, the message had been clearly delivered. The truth of Allah had been established. The system of oppression under Pharaoh had been destroyed. A new generation had been shaped under divine guidance. The foundations of faith, law, and moral responsibility had been established within the community. But completion in prophetic journeys does not mean rest in the worldly sense. It means fulfillment of duty. It means that what was entrusted has been delivered fully, without compromise. Musa, a.s., continued to guide his people with patience. Even when they struggled, even when they repeated mistakes, even when they drifted between remembrance and forgetfulness, he remained firm in his role. Because the mission was never about perfection of people, it was about delivery of truth. In the later period of his life, Musa, a.s., continued to remind his people of the core principles that had defined their entire journey: worship Allah alone, uphold justice, avoid corruption, and remain grateful for the blessings they had received. He reminded them of Egypt, not as a place of nostalgia, but as a lesson. A reminder of what happens when arrogance takes root and when oppression becomes systemized. He reminded them of the sea, not as a miracle to be forgotten, but as a sign that divine power is always above human limitation. He reminded them that their survival was not accidental. It was mercy. And mercy comes with responsibility. These reminders were not new revelations, but reinforcement of truths they had already witnessed. And yet, repetition was necessary, because human hearts often require repeated guidance before stability is achieved. As time moved forward, the community began to stabilize more than before. The wandering years had shaped a stronger foundation. New generations carried forward the teachings they had inherited. The memory of direct miracles slowly transformed into structured belief systems and moral codes. This transition marked an important stage in any prophetic narrative, when direct experience becomes inherited knowledge, and when lived miracles become preserved lessons. Musa, a.s., witnessed this transformation as part of his lifelong mission. His role had always been to bridge divine truth with human understanding. And now, that bridge had been built across generations. Even though challenges still existed, the foundation of belief in Allah had been firmly established among those who accepted the message sincerely. As the life of Musa, a.s., approached its final phase, his journey reflected a complete arc of human and divine interaction. From the moment he was placed in the river by his mother in trust, to his upbringing in the palace of Pharaoh, to his exile, to his revelation in the sacred valley, to his confrontation with tyranny, to the liberation of a nation, and finally to the shaping of a community, every stage was part of a divine plan. There was no moment wasted. No hardship without meaning. No delay without purpose. His life demonstrated that divine guidance often unfolds gradually, through trials that shape character, and through experiences that build resilience. And more importantly, it demonstrated that success in the divine sense is not measured by comfort, but by completion of responsibility. With the passage of time, the era directly shaped by Musa, a.s., began to settle into history. The generation that witnessed the miracles firsthand slowly gave way to those who learned through teaching and tradition. The legacy he left behind was not limited to a single moment or event. It was a complete transformation of a people who had once lived under oppression and were now guided by a covenant with Allah. The system of belief he established would continue to influence generations far beyond his lifetime. The message of monotheism, justice, patience, and accountability became deeply rooted in the identity of those who followed his teachings. And though his physical journey reached its end, the impact of his mission did not end with him. The legacy of Musa, a.s., is not only one of miracles, but of transformation. It is a legacy that shows how Allah raises individuals from vulnerability to leadership, from fear to courage, from exile to mission, and from obscurity to historical permanence. It is also a legacy that reveals the complexity of guiding people, not just freeing them from external oppression, but helping them overcome internal struggle. His life stands as a reminder that truth is not always accepted quickly, that patience is essential in leadership, and that divine guidance often unfolds in stages across time. Even Pharaoh, who once declared himself supreme, became a lesson for all generations. And Musa, a.s., who once fled in fear, became a symbol of courage grounded in divine trust. The story of Musa, a.s., concludes not with silence, but with meaning that continues beyond time. His journey from the river to the palace, from exile to revelation, from confrontation to liberation, and from leadership to legacy forms one of the most profound narratives of faith, patience, and divine wisdom. It teaches that no circumstance is beyond change, no tyranny is beyond its end, and no believer is ever alone when they stand upon truth. And so, the life of Musa, a.s., becomes more than history. It becomes a mirror for every generation, showing that even in the darkest moments, light is already in motion, and the plan of Allah is always unfolding toward justice, mercy, and truth.